Okay, everyone. So as folks are getting online, I'll probably leave this up for a few more seconds. If you haven't already, please record your response. If you're wondering if you're in the right place, yes, this is science communication in a virtual world. So we'll get started with the content slides momentarily, and we appreciate you all for joining us today. All right, I'm going to close this and you'll be able to see. So let's share the results. Okay, so how prepared do you feel to connect with broader audiences who are non-scientific? And a decent bell curve, so most popular responses somewhere in the middle. All right, well, hopefully after our hour together, maybe some of those will go up. So welcome everyone to Communicating Science, Science Communication in a Virtual World. I am Shane Hanlon, my colleague Olivia with me as well. We'll get into more about us in a second. But before we do that, just briefly some things about who we are and what we do. So we are a program of sharing, or excuse me, American Geophysical Union. If you're not familiar, AGU is an Earth and Space Science Society of 60,000+ members from all around the world. We cover a whole slew of different disciplines. Within AGU is the Sharing Science program, and that's what I do, that's what Olivia does. We have Sharing Science in our title, and our whole thing is that we want to help fellow scientists communicate better. And we do this through a whole slew of different ways, and we provide skills to help scientists talk to a whole bunch of different audiences. And so the way in which we do this in different times, in non-COVID times, we do a lot of in-person workshops. We really love that in-person interaction, but we just can't do that right now. And frankly, it's not always possible for people to go to in-person things. So we're really pleased to be able to offer webinars like this. And we have a whole series coming up, which we'll talk about. But beyond workshops and webinars, we have a ton of online resources through our website and our community, which we'll talk about at the end. We have a very active social media presence on Twitter. We can even, depending on the situation, put folks in contact with different institutions, organizations for outreach opportunities, or provide outreach opportunities through AGU, and even hands-on support. And that's doesn't necessarily mean in-person hands-on support, but we can do one-on-one consultations and email back and forth. So however is best for you to learn how to communicate better, we can provide that opportunity. I wanted to touch on this as well. So this is the first of many webinars we're going to be doing this year. And the whole idea are the skills for being a complete scientist. And what we mean by that is academia often doesn't provide a lot of what people consider, I guess, soft skills, communication skills, policy writing, whatever it might be. And so we want to fill the place of that, or at least provide more opportunities to learn. So if you'll see here, we have the SciComm one. We're doing a handful on online engagement, a couple on advocacy, and a couple related to preparing for our annual meeting. And it doesn't have to just be for our annual meeting. And then one on working with international partners. So if you're interested in this, we'll keep you all posted, but this is the list here, and we'll provide this at the end as well. Okay. So who is talking to you, this disembodied voice? Like I said, my name is Shane. I am one of the 2 core members of the Sharing Science program. I'm a PhD ecologist by training. I really enjoyed that work. I enjoyed the research I did. I'm a herpetologist, studied amphibians and reptiles, but I wanted to see what happened to science outside of the manuscripts and the lectures and the meetings. And so I catapulted myself into the policy world after I got my PhD. I liked policy, but it wasn't really for me 100% of the time. And so I found my way to AGU, where I get to dabble in a whole slew of different things and communicate and teach communication, do a lot of the things that I really enjoyed about research. Olivia?
Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia, as Shane mentioned, and I am also a biology PhD. We didn't plan this for those of us who are working on sharing science. It was just sort of a happy coincidence. But yeah, I studied the sex lives of marine snails for my PhD, which are surprisingly interesting, in case you're wondering. But in spite of that, I also have a background in writing and communication, and I thought, well, maybe there's a niche for me in this SciComm realm because so many people outside of science don't really seem to understand how science works. I had a bit of a circuitous path because, of course, my mentors within academia didn't know how to direct me to other spheres. But I finally ended up at AGU helping them develop their sharing science program. And I've been at AGU now for about 8 years.
Great, thanks, Olivia. All right, so that's a little bit about us and AGU and all the things that sharing science has to offer. So now let's actually get into why you all are here today, and that is science communication. And with any sort of communication, science or otherwise, it is so very important to think about who your audience is, because choosing the right audience is really important for who they are, for what your message is, for the type of language you'll use, for a whole number of different things. And so what I want to do is, because since we can't be in the room with you all, we want to know a little bit more about you. So I'm going to throw up another poll here. What types of audiences are you most interested in engaging with? This is not a complete list by any means, but if you have engaged with some of these groups, if you would like to engage with some of these groups, please let us know so we can kind of get a sense of what y'all are interested in. And if the answer is other, I apologize. There's just only so many options we can put into the polls. All right, I'm gonna close this and then share. So a lot of interest in policy or public groups. That's great, and that's probably the most catch-all one. That's our that means so many different things. So that's not surprising that that's what folks are interested in. A little bit with journalists, a decent amount with policymakers. Personal relationships, I really like that one. That's always really great to see folks interested in just sharing science with people they know, people they might be related to. And other scientists, which is one we haven't traditionally thought about within sharing science, because the whole thing is to get science out there to broader groups. But it's really important just to be able to talk to scientists, of course, who aren't in your field, but even in your field. And so hopefully the things we cover today will apply to any sort of communication you want to do to any audience. We had a couple comments about folks not being able to see the polls. I apologize for that. That just happens sometimes to certain individuals. There's no rhyme or reason to it. So if it doesn't show up for you, I apologize. And I thank all of you for participating. So yeah, choosing the right audience is really important. So we're going to do a little bit of pretend time here. So this is me. Like I said, I'm a herpetologist, studied amphibians and reptiles in a previous life. But I would go to different places to share my science, to communicate about my science. So I remember going to something like a fifth grade classroom. And going into that classroom, I had to think about the types of questions that these kids would ask me. I'd get things like, do toads give you warts? No. Are frogs poisonous? Well, I mean, they can be. What's the difference between a frog and a toad? Oh, there's a lot of things, but you kind of have to see it to really know. Or something just like, I like frogs. That's not a question. But these are the types of things, these are the types of questions or statements that I would get going into a classroom, really any sort of classroom. And so knowing what types of questions I'd be asked, knowing something about those fifth graders was really helpful when I was preparing uh, the talk I was going to give, the presentation or whatever it might be. Something completely different. Say if I was called into a chamber of commerce and I was called in as an expert on amphibians and reptiles, and they're talking about development and will these animals be harmed, or what should we know about them? Types of questions there would be, well, why should I care about frogs? And that's a complex answer. There's a lot of things they provide. ecosystem benefits, they provide health benefits, all sorts of stuff. Is a frog worth more than economic development? Well, not necessarily, but there should be and can be some sort of compromise. Can't we just move them? Maybe, but that's the whole point. Knowing about why they're important and knowing about where they would have to live and how that trade-off would be made is valuable. Or frankly, the statement like, oh yeah, I like frogs. Like frogs are really neat. A very, very different audience. And I have no idea what types of questions for sure that I would be asked, but I can think about who they are and what they care about to help better prepare. Now, these are two very discrete audiences. These are people that I could probably know a decent amount about because, yeah, they're very specific. But what about something like social media, like right now, where all of us, or almost all of us, if we are communicating, is probably doing it digitally in some way. And social media has been around for long before COVID, but a lot of us are taking to social media now to share our science more than we might have been before. And so social media is all over the place, right? Just identification questions or questions about snakes being poisonous. And by the way, they're usually venomous and not poisonous. Poisonous if you eat them, venomous if they bite you. Or people just giving you statements that you didn't ask for about your research or the message you're trying to communicate or whatever it might be. Or again, kind of like the I like frog version of this, like, look how cool this thing is. Social media is difficult to identify who your audience is, but knowing that's valuable because you can plan for all sorts of different things. And the trade-off with social media is that you don't have to engage with folks you don't want to, for the most part. I will say there's always exceptions, but you can ignore people or just not answer their questions or whatever it might be. So social media is a different monster, but also thinking about the types of things you might be asked on social media or just being prepared for a whole lot of different things can be really helpful. And there's also this, so many of us are in Zoom or Hangouts or Skype calls or whatever it might be. And this is just a different technology for probably a specific audience. So this is, just think about this as if you were going to an in-person meeting. It's just a different technology now. You can still know a lot about your audience, just the way in which you talk to them might be a little bit different. So there's a whole slew of different types of communities that you can connect with, especially now. That is one kind of silver lining of this, and has always been true, frankly, but we're not geographically constrained on who we communicate with. Technology is a great thing for that. And so if you're just starting out or thinking about ways to reach beyond groups that you've traditionally communicated with, a great thing is to start with what you know. So say maybe you're affiliated with some sort of religious group or institution. You can think about how your science might be interesting to them, or maybe some sort of volunteer group. But the flip side of this is true as well. If you for example, really hate camping and you're just not into the outdoors, you're not a wilderness person, well, then maybe trying to communicate your science to a wilderness group just isn't going to cut it. Now, there are people who go into groups specifically who might be combative to them, who they actually want to change their minds and change their opinions. And that's great, like more power to you. But that's not to say you have to do that, especially if you're just starting out or just looking for ways to maybe expand your reach. So just something to consider. But when thinking about different types of groups, you might be thinking, well, my research doesn't necessarily apply to any group that I can think of off the top of my head. And some areas of research will be easier to find overlap than others, but there's probably going to be something. So some examples we have. Say you study charismatic megafauna, right? Like whales or polar bears or something like that. Well, there's all sorts of groups that might be interested in that. You could do wildlife photographers, you could do tourism boards, you could do, I was going to say, travel industry, which is, again, a little bit different right now, but there's going to be different groups that might be interested. How about something like space weather? This might seem really specific. This is like how solar flares might affect power grids or something like that. But there are audiences for that. There are utility companies. There's always classrooms students are always interested in hearing about all sorts of different science, no matter who they are. Or there might be even federal agencies who are interested in your expertise, depending on what it is. Or maybe you study something really, really broad, something like climate change. And I know there's different aspects of climate change, but that's just something that people are going to be interested in. So you really can run the gamut of types of groups that might be interested in hearing from you. These can be, yeah, outdoors groups, nature's groups, photography. This could be tourism. This could be natural hazards groups, local, like your local greenhouse or whatever it might be. So think about different groups who might be interested in hearing from you. Maybe the connection might not be as obvious as it would be for some others, but there's probably something there. So once you've thought about who your audience is, now it's time to actually connect with them. And what I mean by that is think about, well, what do you want to get out of this? Like, why are you reaching out to this group? But on the flip side, think about what they want. They're going to have a reason to want to listen to you, to want to, whether it's come to your presentation or whatever it might be, like they need to get something out of it. And to figure out what they want to get out of it, what their goals are, it's important to think about who are they? What are their demographics? What are their values, their interests, their concerns? What do they care about? And think about why your science or your message, whatever it is, should matter to this group. And this is framing. And this is a comic that Olivia actually drew about, and she likes to say it's about her time as a scientist, or excuse me, as a researcher, so excited about sharing her work with others that they really think about would they care about it. And I can certainly say that this has happened to me as well. So gung-ho about the work I was doing that I wasn't thinking about, do the people that I'm talking to actually care about it? Or how can I put it in a way, how can I communicate it in a way that they will care about? And framing is not necessarily about convincing someone of anything. It's about presenting like the science and knowledge in a way that's important to the audience. And a really great way to do this, and this is not a panacea, like a one size fits all thing, but you could do a we care about statement. So things like children's future, health, water quality, quality of life, jobs, economy, national identity, etc. There's hopefully something that you can relate to your audience, some way in which you can relate to your audience, and that might make your science and your message more appealing to them. So some examples here. Research into hurricane behavior can help businesses and homeowners better secure their buildings and residences for the power effects of wind. So that's really great. As a skier, I really appreciate the next one. Changes in winter snowpack can have dramatic effects on the ski slopes your club enjoys when talking about the consequences of climate change. On the flip side of that, heat waves affect our health as well as our energy bills. I'm really concerned about this. I'm someone who's constantly quite warm, and AC, I would say, I think is one of the best inventions from a quality of life perspective. Uh, um, that I really appreciate. Or maybe it's just even from a like an agriculture perspective. So if you're talking to farmers, shifts in the start of spring can alter the flowers we plant and the pests that eat them. When thinking about how climate change is shifting seasons. So there are specific ways to relate to these, some groups you might be interested in. And so just things to think about, kind of the take-home message of when thinking about your audience. All audiences are different, and they're all going to care about different things. To the best of your abilities, try to figure out what those things are. Some audiences will be more immediately interested in your work. Find them, find those people. These are the easy lifts. And for any audiences, or excuse me, any audience, there are tips like connecting on shared values that can let you be effective. So think about these things when you are thinking about your audience. Oops. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to Olivia, who's going to talk about speaking the same language.
Thanks so much, Shane. So yeah, so now that you've thought a little bit about who your audiences are and what your audiences care about, how do you talk to them in a way that they're going to find accessible and interesting? Well, you want to speak the same language. And I want to emphasize that this is not dumbing down. I hate that term. I think it's unfortunately condescending. And it's really not about assuming that your audience is stupid. It's really about understanding that your audience cares about specific things and has a different vocabulary for it than you do. So you want to use clear terms, you want to avoid jargon and a ton of acronyms that aren't going to be known to your audience. You want to give context that, again, people outside your field are not going to have. And you want to avoid getting into a level of detail that is going to matter to you and to other researchers, but not to people outside your field. So what is jargon that we just talked about? So technical terminology or characteristic idioms of a specific activity or group, obscure and pretentious language marked by circumlocutions and long words. I think it's nice that the Webster definition includes circumlocutions. Just a little jargon there for you. So again, the reason to reduce jargon or eliminate it if you possibly can is because, as with this comic here, you think that you're telling someone something and they're fascinated, but instead you've simply put up an additional barrier to understanding that just doesn't need to be there. And jargon encompasses a lot of different things. It's that technical terminology, it's undefined or excessive acronyms. You know, Shane and I are in the DC area here. It's just rife with acronyms, um, many of which mean different things to different people. It's obscure words, it's unnecessarily long words, and it's words with multiple meanings that can also get in the way of having your audience sort of stay connected to you. What do I mean by words with multiple meanings? Well, most people, when they hear modeling, are not thinking about computer simulations. Similarly, if you talk about something and mention mean, they're probably not going to be thinking of arithmetic averages. They're going to be thinking of how cruel someone was. False, really not likely to be thinking about earthquakes or seismology. Um, and this is Greta, the jargon monster, and in her mouth are a ton of words that have been taken from the abstracts of journal articles. Now, all of these words are perfectly reasonable words to be in journal article abstracts. However, they are not good words to use if you are talking to communities outside of your scientific discipline. And I mention this, and Greta is a monster because jargon is really pervasive and it's very hard to always know that you're using it or not. Once you become sort of embedded in a discipline, you don't even necessarily know that you're talking in jargon. So we have some ways to help you reduce jargon. A couple of exercises, one of which is really fun, I think. You may be familiar with the comic XKCD, which was created by Randall Munroe. He used to be a physicist at NASA before he started drawing comics full time. And one of his very famous comics is the Upgoer 5. So he drew a schematic of the Saturn V rocket and explained it using only the 1,000 most common words in English. Only he called them the 1,000 most common words because 1,000 is not one of them. And it has humor like, people box, but it also explains everything. Now, this took off, and people have developed text editors that will let you use only the 1,000 most common words. And some have been able to create very eloquent descriptions of their science based on this. So, all the animals and green things we see in the world have all been made by the same fixed, easy steps acting all around us. These easy steps, taken in the largest sense, are being, growing, and having babies, being like your parents, but not exactly like them, and being able to avoid dying for as long as possible. And this is a really clever way of describing evolution through natural selection using very simple language. So again, there are editors out there that will let you enter your research, and it'll underline if you're using one of the words that's disallowed, and let you simplify your research. Now, I hasten to say, in spite of that eloquent example I gave you, we do not recommend that you do this and then go out and actually talk to people or put this on your social media or your next Skype a scientist or something, because people, that is dumbing down, frankly. But the great thing about it is that once you reduce uh, what you're saying, once you're able to get to the heart of what you're talking about in the simplest language possible, bringing it back up to a conversational level is so much easier than just trying to go in and do synonym for jargon words. And you can see examples of this that's been done by others. We have an UpGoer 5 Challenge scientific session at AGU's fall meeting. If you look at the hashtag listed here on Twitter, you can see examples of how it's been used by others in past years and get some ideas of how people are doing it and doing it very well. And again, another really great way to make sure that you're making your science more accessible is talk to someone outside your field. Everybody's doing much more sort of online social interaction now, right? Zoom happy hours and FaceTime and so on. The next time that you're doing this with someone who doesn't study your kind of science, say, hey, can I talk to you for a minute about what I do? And you can tell me if it makes sense or not. You can have them count your jargon words. You can have them repeat back to you or summarize. Just see how well it's working, because the more you practice, the more clear you will be. So again, sorry, did this a little wrong, but jargon is everywhere. So it's really hard to know when you're using it or not. And it's not just those technical words that can get in the way of understanding. It's also words with multiple meanings or acronyms. And there are lots of options, though, for how to reduce it, whether you're using the UpGoer 5 editor or you're talking with people outside your field to see how they respond. And again, it's not dumbing down. This is about being accessible to people in the way that you want to. And it will really increase your professional success. So not just reaching out to wider audiences, but if you want to collaborate with scientists in other disciplines, they're going to be drawn to you when they find out that you can talk with them in a way that you can both communicate. It's more likely to get grants. You're going to have dissemination by journalists. We have, among our many online toolkits that we offer, one on jargon, with a list of sort of dual meaning words on the front and a worksheet on the back that you can use. And another great way to get inspiration for reducing jargon and to try it out yourself is through plain language summaries, which AGU journals and many others offer as an addition to the scientific abstract. So this is basically making your abstract, again, more accessible. So you could talk about Chrysostria virginica physiological rates across a range of salinities and temperatures, or you could say, if we want to effectively predict the growth and health of commercially important eastern oysters, we need to know how their physiology changes in habitats that have different salt and oxygen concentrations. So note that that's not only simpler, but I added in some context there. Commercially important eastern oysters, because now we understand more about what the value is, what the human impact can be of this study. So you don't have to read through this, just sort of notice the difference between the abstract and a plain language summary. There are fewer numbers, right? It's a little bit shorter, although that's not always the case. And you can see that they've provided context, like introduction of old carbon previously stored in soil can increase net flux. This is because reverse transport, and they give a nice little social math in there. Now, there is a little bit that I think could have been made more accessible even, but this is a nice example of how to translate something that's very relevant for a technical audience to a wider audience. I'll skip this one because it's much the same thing. And you could see examples. We share these a lot on our Sharing Science Twitter from our journals. So you can see this example about calving activity. And then another example as well around lava flow. And again, we share these very regularly. So if you're following us on social media, you can see examples of how other people have taken their science and put it into plainer language. We also have another one-pager, a toolkit that you can download from our website that's about how to create a plain language summary. So we have some guidelines on the front and again, a worksheet on the back that you can use to help develop this for yourself. So with that, now that you've thought a bit about what jargon is and how to reduce it, Shane's going to talk about how to make compelling messages using less jargon.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. Just a couple things actually I want to mention before we go into that is one, some of you are using the chat box, the question box. If you have questions throughout, just throw them in there. We're going to get to those at the end. And two, there's a handouts button somewhere on your dashboard, your control panel for for GoToWebinar, and it actually has a lot of these toolkits in there. So you can download them directly from there, but we'll also provide some follow-up information as well when we get back in touch after the webinar. All right, so we know who we're talking to, and we know, I guess, mostly what not to say, but how do you put that all together into actually making a message? Well, first off, it's really important to think about what's a message, and it's really just about clarity. It's this distillation of your key points. It's your take home. So some things to think about when developing your message is keep things relevant to your audience. This is a factual statement. The level of soil moisture in our area have decreased by such and such amount in the past 3 years. We get that, we can understand that, but that doesn't mean anything to a lot of folks. Instead, drought in our area has intensified, putting pressure on our already stressed water resources, increasing the threat of wildfire. This is relevant. This gets to why people would care about it. Use metaphors. Metaphors are such a powerful thing in all of communication, but especially in the sciences. So, for example, sharing spectrum would make the data transfer from satellites such as GO-16 harder to interpret. So spectrum, if you're not familiar, is basically just this invisible, this waveband that transmits information from the Earth to satellites. And so picture like an invisible highway, essentially. That's spectrum. And so the statement, okay, well, if you have to have more people on spectrum, sure, that might slow things down. But a metaphor is even a better way to explain it. Imagine looking at a map through blinds. This is what the data from satellites look like if we have to share spectrum. And most, if not all of us, have looked through kind of Venetian blinds, as you can imagine. Yeah, you can get what the picture is, but it's not as clear as it would be without the blinds. And so some resources, we'll pass these along, but if you're looking for ways to create good metaphors, frankly, there are just a ton of options and great resources out there. We'll include a handful in follow-up, but just Googling will probably do you will do you good. Think about the value, emphasize that of your work of science. So I study coronal mass ejections and other space weather. Before coming to AGU, I had no idea what coronal mass ejections were. And again, if there are scientists who actually study this, I apologize. But for my purposes, they're solar flares, right? Okay, but this again is a fact, but it doesn't necessarily mean something to someone. They might be thinking, well, why should I care about that? Okay. Well, the research that I and others do on conditions on the sun helps predict and prepare for major power grid outages and disconnects with our weather and GPS satellites. Oh, okay. Well, that's really valuable. Yeah, I should know more about that or should at least care about it. Use social math. Olivia alluded to this earlier, but if you have something like this volcano spurts jets of rocks and gas into the air, it's now oozing around 80,000 cubic meters or 3 million cubic feet. I have no idea how much that is. Social math is a way of putting things into a perspective that you might be able to relate to or understand, or at least somewhat visualize. Okay, so instead of just 80,000 cubic meters, enough to fill 32 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Now, I can't imagine that any of us has ever seen in person 32 Olympic-sized swimming pools, but most of us can think of what one Olympic-sized swimming pool looks like, and 32 of those, wow, that's a lot. And that gives me a lot more perspective than just 80,000 cubic meters. And there's some really great resources for this, actually. There's the measure of things, there's getting the picture. You can actually plug in your number, and these will generate, they'll spit out to you different things that we might be able to relate to. And so you can go to either of these websites, and again, we'll have all this information in the follow-up email. Some more development tips. So be brief, but not too brief. Something like, I studied the Pine Island Glacier. Neat, but what do you actually study there? Like you go there, but that's not quite enough. I studied the Pine Island Glacier, the fastest melting glacier in Antarctica, responsible for about a quarter of Antarctica's ice loss so far. Oh, well, that's really important and that's valuable. Okay, yeah, that those extra few words give so much more context. And we're kind of taught that brevity is paramount, right? The whole idea of the elevator pitch. And yes, elevator pitches are incredibly important. Being able to distill your message into these kind of bite-sized pieces that people will hold on to and want to listen to, that's really, really important. But again, there's always a balance, making sure that all of the information you want to be in there is still in there. A really fun place to think about this is you can go to this website, onesentence.org, and these are one-sentence stories. And I would love to dive into this, and we'll do this another time. But in one sentence, it's amazing what people can convey. And you're not obviously going to get the whole picture, but you can start getting pieces of the picture and figure out using context clues what these one-sentence stories, what the larger story is there too. So that's a fun, non-scientific, but a fun resource that could be valuable nonetheless. Give examples related to people's lives. So if you say something like, we're seeing an increasing abundance of invasive species in the Chesapeake Bay, okay, invasive species are bad, I get that. But again, it's not necessarily, there's nothing to latch onto there. When X and Y species invade the bay, they push out blue crabs, which provide money for the Maryland and Delaware economy each year. Oh, okay, so it's an economic issue among other things, but people care about money, so they're going to care about that. That example is really relevant to them. And this is difficult this could be difficult in the best of times, but end on a positive note and talk about how science can be part of a solution. Nobody's going to take you seriously if you're asking them to recycle while also spouting off that it's the end of the world. We are programmed as humans, like there's biology behind this, that we respond more positively to a positive message. And so if we're asked, especially if we're telling folks to take action or something like that, being positive or ending on a positive note is important. So something like, we have an opportunity to safeguard our quality of life and make sure that our communities, health, resources, environment are enjoyed by generations to come. It can be challenging. I come from a conservation background where amphibians are the most endangered and threatened class of vertebrate in the world. So I have some experience in this. But again, talking about how your science or your message or whatever it is can be part of the solution can be one way to end on that positive note. And with science communication, we talk so much about, like, this refrain comes up all the time. Now it's more important than ever to be able to talk about your science and what you do and share your science. And this has been the case for a while now, whether it's trying to get funding. Being able to talk about your research is paramount if you want money for it, whether that's to do the actual science or if there's an outreach component to it. Being able to advocate for science, being part of the science policy process, or just even just getting your science out there. There are so many reasons why science communication is valuable. But this refrain has renewed meaning, I guess, now, because all many of us can do is communicate. Many places, labs are shut down, universities are shut down, field sites are closed, whatever it might be. And so now there's more communication than ever. And I found this fascinating. I did a screen grab the other day of just the COVID-19 hashtag, and this is live refreshing, and it refreshes every like 3 or 4 seconds. But every 3 or 4 seconds, 10 more tweets came through on COVID-19. And probably most of us are not studying COVID-19. Maybe some of us are, but regardless, science is having a moment now, and being able to communicate that science is really important, and be able to communicate it via this virtual world in which we live is even more important. So hopefully we're providing some tips and tools that are useful in that. So what is the take-home message of the take-home message part? Well, messages are a great way to distill your work into what matters. These are, again, this is what we're doing literally right now, what you're looking at. Emphasize the relevance and value of your science and use examples and metaphors. Metaphors are difficult, or usually difficult to come up with initially, but once you get the hang of it, they are so valuable. And end on a positive note. I understand that it might be difficult, but especially if you're making a call to action, make sure in that call to action is some note of positivity, because again, this is what we respond to as people. We are programmed to respond to positivity. We have a worksheet actually when you're trying to create your message, things to think about. There's a front and a back to this. This is also in your handouts, that little toolbar on your go-to widget. So we have this messaging worksheet. And then we also have this kind of more general tips and tools. Again, this is also a front and back, but hopefully lots of good content you're getting out of the webinar, but then some quick guide things that you can just refer to kind of on the fly or maybe share with some of your colleagues and peers. So now what? We're gonna have a Q&A section coming up for the remainder of our time, but I want to do one more poll if you all will entertain me. So this is the same poll that we had at the beginning for those of you who were on. And just, I want to see if anything's changed. I get that it's just an hour, but just interested. Just record your response here. I'll leave this up for, say, a minute or so, and we'll get into what's next and some closing Q&A. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, I've seen that, I haven't been able to check it, but I've seen the chat box light up. So if you have questions, type them in there and we'll get to as many as we can.
And as a reminder, if you're having trouble seeing the poll, try to exit full screen mode. Apparently that's worked for some people to then be able to see it.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. Yeah, the poll can sometimes show up in a separate box. So that's one way, thank you. All right, I'll give about 5 more seconds. All right, I'm gonna close this down. What do we got? Okay, so this is a similar curve, but now it's skewing a little bit more. We have a little bit more fours that were probably previously 2 or 3s, and that's great. And again, I understand this is an hour, I guess 45 minutes, and so how much can we really change in that amount of time? But there is a little bit here, and that's really encouraging because just hopefully by us providing these skills, or at least place to find these skills, y'all are more confident or think you might have the tools to communicate your science more broadly. And so with that, I will hand it over to Olivia, who's gonna round out the presentation portion of this.
Thanks, Shane. And thanks to all of you for attending. So just as a reminder, if you liked this, if you want to learn more about engagement, especially as we are thinking about how to engage in new ways during this time of the pandemic, please consider the rest of our webinar series. When you get an email, we'll be sending one out to all attendees after this with more information on these. And as soon as registration opens for any of these, you can follow us on Twitter and see the links available as well. So do keep these in mind. And, check out our websites, check out our blogs. You can see lots of opportunities to find out more about what kind of resources we provide for you and what opportunities you have to engage through us. And please follow us on social media. We're on all the social media as HU and individually, and would be very happy to have you on there adding to the conversation, because that's what we try to do with all of these platforms. And we have a podcast too that if you're interested in being interviewed for, definitely let us know, but you can also listen to see some of how other scientists are telling stories around science and really sort of see some great examples of the humanizing of science and talking about the elements of science that we don't always share in our research presentations or papers. And finally, please consider joining the Sharing Science community. And again, we'll send a link to you with all of this information as well. But this allows you a platform through which you can communicate with each other as well as us. And we also provide a lot of resources, including a really great library of social science on science communication that you have access to. So do consider doing that as well.
All right. Well, thank you, Olivia. So I think now we have time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've gotten some already.
All right. And I'm actually, while we do this, I'm going to go back to the social media slide just because it has a lot of information on it.
Sure. And I'll start the Q&A. So yes, this webinar is being recorded, so we'll send you the link to the archive for those who are asking if you get the slides afterwards. So one question that we got was, how do you balance accuracy versus conversational level of communication? I've heard many experts complain about how they can't do this because it reduces accuracy. I think that if you're not in that realm, then getting them to understand is way more important than being dead on accurate. And yes, I agree entirely. You're probably not going to be as pinpoint precise if you're using a more conversational level, but you don't need to be, and it's not actually going to reach your audience anyway. So why be in the weeds thinking that you're giving all the information when what you've actually done is lost your audience completely? They don't need to know every single detail. You know, I'm a PhD in biology. If I go to the mechanic because something's acting up with my car, I don't want them to give me every single detail. I just want to know things like, in general, what's wrong, how long is it going to take to fix it, and how much is it going to cost to fix it. So you have to think about what elements of your work are going to be relevant and important to your audience. And then, Shane, we had a question that I think you could address. It's my experience that the messenger for some communities is just as important as the message being communicated. What's your take on the nature of the communicator and how the audience receives their contribution? And how should SciCommerce deal with this?
Sure. And actually, since we're here, I'll just throw on my webcam so you can actually put a face to the voices coming at you. It's like when you hear, oh, hi, Olivia. It's like when you hear, I listen to a lot of talk radio, so it's always weird. But this is actually perfect because I talk about this all the time. I am a straight white male, and I am not the face of science. I am one of many faces of science. And so there are just some communities that I do not belong to, and that's fine. But I also probably shouldn't be the messenger in that community. Thinking about who your audience is, one, yes, it means like thinking about what they care about, what their values are, and how your message might resonate with them. But it also might be thinking about will it at all, or are you actually that person to be the messenger to that community? And maybe sometimes the answer is no, or maybe there's some sort of balance. We've actually worked with we know a decent amount of scientists who are not part of the communities in which they are communicating or working, but they've worked very closely to establish very close personal relationships with a handful of members of that community. And so they actually have kind of a bridge into it so that they can be trusted messengers and they can be people that the community are listening to. So I don't want to say that if you're not a member of this community, you shouldn't be in there, but just really think about that because science has been weaponized, it's been unkind, it's been used in ways in certain communities that it hasn't been used in others. And so that's going to change how those folks relate to science and relate to the messenger. So I guess my take home is just be aware of that. And if you're not that person, that's okay. Just keep that in mind.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Shane. Another question we had was how to communicate social science. Since social science is already descriptive, how do you write plain language summaries? Good question. I think if you feel that you're already at a very plain language level, then great. But I would say that with every discipline, even if it's descriptive, there are probably a lot of words that are either straight up technical terminology jargon or words that mean something very specific within social science that have a much broader meaning to the community at large. Just to think of one from science generally, you know, significant results mean something very different. So being aware of those kinds of terms and trying to translate them, as it were, for a wider audience can be really valuable. And then, Shane, we have a question. How should we deal with training young scientists in better communication methods when their PIs are more old school? They may be denied the better method of communicating science because it doesn't use jargon.
Yeah, we like to say like the skills we're providing are for all scientists at all scales and levels in profession and that, but we do get a lot of folks who are early on in career, whether that's undergraduate, graduate, early career, whatever it might be. And there is a generational divide, or there can be sometimes, that more entrenched, the older generation of scientists, they just don't want to communicate in a way that is not quote unquote scientific. One is perseverance. There is a slowly a sea change happening where all generations of scientists are seeing the value in this. And again, sometimes it's just, it has to, like, grants require outreach now. They require a science communication element. So even if they don't, if there are scientists who don't want to change, they kind of have to. But two, there is such a great community of scientists and science communicators out there. And I mean that for, like, literally, like, sharing science has a community of science communicators, but just through social media, at conferences, informally. So you can find your people. And chances are there are more folks out there who are doing this type of stuff who are receptive to it and see the value in it. And so it might just be finding that network elsewhere and understanding the value of it, and kind of just taking your losses with, maybe it's an advisor or a PI or something. And I'm not advocating for, like, uh, going behind someone's back or anything like that, but you might find that support and find people who understand the necessity of this and the role of this elsewhere. And that's okay. There are people who do it. So if you can't find it in-house, you can kind of almost, I guess, go out of house.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. I agree. I think finding those wider communities is a real value. Um, and getting recognition from scientific societies, which are working hard to recognize scientists doing SciComm, can help you get some legitimacy then back at your institution if you're finding pushback from those you're working with more directly. One question, where would you suggest we shared the communication summaries to get maximum impact? This depends on what you're communicating and whom your target audience is, really. There are lots of different ways. If we're thinking, again, in a more virtual realm, whom do you want to reach out to? Do you want to just share on a social media platform? And again, we'll be talking more in later webinars about which platform might be best for you and the kinds of products you have to share. Are you hoping to reach out to do some sort of Skype or other things with classrooms because you feel that your summaries are really relevant to those groups? Are you trying to connect with journalists? Maybe there are blogs that you want to write for or guest post for that are going to reach the audiences that you're looking for. It really varies a lot. Let's see, what are some other questions that we have here? Okay, in your opinion, what is the best? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Shane.
So I was just going to say, there's one about asking about data visualization and how that's changing science communication. And the answer is in a positive way, frankly. So science communication isn't all of this, what we're doing. It's not just talking to people. Uh, this is a part I love about it. But everyone digests information in very different ways. And so having, yeah, like a data viz or a cartoon or a comic or a song or whatever it might be, there are so many different ways to ingest science. And so I think that the more ways in which we are communicating science, the more types of mediums we're using, the more ways that we're putting it out there, the better. So I think that, like, data visualization is so very important. Things like infographics, things like science and art. I mean, all of this stuff, none of it's mutually exclusive. And I think all of it is beneficial because different audiences, that's like another thing to think about with audiences, different audiences are going to take in information differently depending on the medium through which it's being transmitted. So I think there's definitely a place for it, and none of this stuff's mutually exclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question, what's the best approach to talk with the public about sensitive topics such as evolution or versus creationism, that kind of thing? Yeah, definitely a good question, but and we don't have time to go into a lot of details now, but really it goes back to what we've been talking about knowing your audience and about who you are in relation to your audience. So sometimes you might not be the best person or the best person alone to talk with whichever audience you're talking with. There's this whole issue around areas of science that have become sort of politicized or otherwise affiliated with a value system. You need to go in there with a trusted messenger if you're not one yourself, someone who is a part of that community, but is also open to you and wants to help you communicate what you're talking about. And then again, it's about focusing first and foremost on connection and building trust before you even start moving into talking about the actual information you want to convey.
And I'll just add quickly to that. It's all of communication, science or otherwise, is about listening first. It's not about spewing out whatever you have to say. It's about learning about these people and listening. But that's especially important with sensitive topics. That is especially important with people who think that you might be out to get them or whatever it might be. I'm from coal country in rural Pennsylvania, and talking about climate change there is really difficult. But when you listen to these people about, they're not anti-science in the way that like science is really bad. They are anti-science, or not anti-science, but they are worried about jobs. They're worried about economy. They're worried about their living. And I'm not saying this excuses a belief or an acceptance or anything, but that at least gets you in the mindset of why they might be pushing back on what you're saying. So listening is so, so valuable.
Agreed. One question that we had was, when we communicate science to the public, how is the audience able to differentiate between your valid research and fake news or pseudoscience? That's a really fair point, and that is a challenge. Uh, part of it is just getting out there and making sure that the more and more scientists that we have who are able to communicate effectively and well and respectfully, but also firmly about the real science, the better, because the more you can inundate the market, as it were, the more your voice is going to be heard. Um, Also, I'd say, connecting around emotions, but not becoming emotional is another way, I think, for people to be able to maybe start to figure out that distinction between what's real and what's hype. But Shane, if you have other thoughts too.
So I think that's very well said. I like the idea of the inundation. The more people that are out there doing it and doing it well, the better, to push out the ones who aren't doing it well. And yes, things can happen. There's misuse of science, or people out there intentionally trying to spread disinformation. There are ways in which science might be like people might comprehend it one way when it's not supposed to be that way. But the more and more folks are out there doing it, the better, because if it's not you, it's going to be someone else. And so that's I can't stress enough, just being out there in some capacity. There are so many different ways to do it. That's the great thing. But being out there in some way is definitely something, I mean, obviously we suggest, because this is what we do for a living.
Exactly. One other question, I know we're running out of time, but one was, has AG recently proposed ways to bridge the digital divide as it relates to science communication for K through 12 in respect to the large number of areas that are without Wi-Fi? This is a great point, and as far as I know, AGU as a whole has not yet engaged in collaborations or addressed this issue. Um, I will say that we know that there are certain programs out there that scientists can be involved in. For example, letters to a pre-scientist, which is actual physical letters. Um, Also, any kind of connection that scientists who want to communicate can make directly with teachers or schools can help, because the teachers themselves will know the best ways to then connect with students. Those are definitely some ideas, but we can explore this further and get back to you as well.
Yeah, and we'll make sure, again, we're probably have time for one more question. We'll make sure that anyone we didn't get to answer that we can, that are probably more broad, we'll include those in a follow-up. We'll have a follow-up email with a whole bunch of information as well. So this isn't the end when we sign off in a minute.
Agreed. We had one more question. How do you, well, we have a number, but how do you translate all this information that seems targeted to mostly native English speakers to non-native communicators? And that's a great question too. You know, honestly, I think we would like to do a better job of that, really. And if you have any ideas for how we can do that and how we can support other scientists who are not coming as native English speakers, we'd be happy to. We are looking into being able to translate some of our resources, but if there are other things that occur to you as well, please reach out to us because we're very open to trying to be more inclusive in that regard.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, well, that's all of our time, and we want to be respectful of your time as well. But again, like I said, if there's anything else, there's a ton of questions in here. Thank you all so much for sticking around and asking questions. We'll make sure to
Yeah,
follow up. We'll send you a follow-up email. And if you liked this, please think about some of the upcoming webinars we have and spread the word. This is how we're going to be connecting with people moving forward, even after the pandemic, because people can just sign on and do this, and this is what we really enjoy. So we hope you enjoyed this and enjoy the rest of your day.
thanks all.
Bye.